So the idea that whole grains are heart healthy or healthy overall for just human health is based on correlational studies almost completely. And just as a reminder, and this is a topic we've touched on previously, correlational studies are those that can only find a coincidence versus causal studies or causation or clinical studies where you can actually say this thing caused another thing. Now, back to the correlational studies, which is the basis of the entire paradigm that whole grains are healthy. These are the kinds of studies that hand people questionnaires and then look at the health of the person. Now, there's conflicting evidence there. And in fact, I will cite one study called the PURE study, P-U-R-E. The PURE study was such a revelation because of its size and its findings. It was a massive multi-country study done over the past few years that involved, I think, upwards of 18,000 people across dozens of countries. And they found that grain consumption, yes, even the revered whole grains, actually predicted higher mortality. So there was a positive correlation between the people that reported eating higher amounts of grains and then just dying more from all cause. Well, that correlational evidence directly challenges the hypothesis, which is, of course, the prevailing view that eating more whole grains is going to help you live longer and better. So the PURE study is one, and we have a link to that in the notes of this show. Now that's correlational, and I don't like correlational evidence. I'm an actual what's called a basic scientist. I like to actually do an intervention, do an experiment, and then see what happens, because then I can say this intervention caused this result. Now, there's another study that I want to reference here, and this was a study done by one of my heroes, Gerald Reaven, and it was published in 1987. And we have a link to that one as well. That is titled "The Deleterious Metabolic Effects of High Carbohydrate, Sucrose-Containing Diets in Patients with Non-Insulin-Dependent Diabetes Mellitus." So that's just a long-winded way of saying, what does a low-fat, high-carb diet do in someone with diabetes? So this diet, it matters because they put people on the proscribed diet by the American Diabetes Association, including healthy whole grains and lower fat meals. This is, of course, the type of food and the type of eating that gets a stamp of approval from the American Diabetes and the American Heart Associations. And yet what happened? Gerald Reaven said it best. His conclusion over these roughly 2 weeks of putting type 2 diabetics on this low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet containing high amounts of whole grains, he reported these results document that low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets containing moderate amounts of sugar, which is allowed. But again, I'm really emphasizing that whole grains were emphasized in the diet. Anyways, it's similar in composition to the recommendations of the American Diabetes Association, have deleterious metabolic effects when consumed by patients with type 2 diabetes. Well, that that directly challenges this idea that whole grains are somehow going to be magically better. In this diet, it wasn't. This study was entitled "Comparison of the DASH Diet and a Higher Fat DASH Diet on Blood Pressure and Lipids and Lipoproteins." And here's the kicker: a randomized controlled trial. So this is the gold standard of studies. The DASH diet matters, and it's helpful for me to point it out because it is the most famous heart-healthy diet that has ever been invented. And the DASH diet is dietary approaches to stop hypertension. And at the heart of the DASH diet is these pillars of more fruits and vegetables, low-fat foods, and whole grains. So those are really the pillars of the DASH diet. And of course, as I mentioned, it's an emphasis on whole grains. Well, this study was quite clever because they reported to put one of the group of subjects on a DASH diet that had some of these aspects, but it was a low carbohydrate, high fat DASH diet where they were eating several times more saturated fat than the conventional low fat DASH diet. And of course, they were eating essentially no whole grains or very, very little whole grains. So it's a direct rebuke of that emphasis on whole grains. The emphasis was rather meat and eggs and eat less whole grains. And wouldn't you know it, they had exact same improvements in blood pressure. And blood pressure matters. That's one of the biggest predictors of whether you're going to have a heart attack or not. But the high-fat DASH diet not only lowered blood pressure to the same degree, but it also further improved lipids, like a greater reduction in triglycerides and VLDL, without any other changes in LDL. So these very popular lipoproteins and lipids that are measured in the blood as markers of heart health and overall mortality got significantly better in the version of the DASH diet that was cutting its whole grains in favor of other sources of energy, like from meat and eggs. So once again, causal evidence that is challenging the long established correlational evidence that whole grains are somehow magically healthy. There are two things I wanted to highlight that comes with the most common whole grain, of course, which is wheat. And that is phytates or phytic acids and gliadin. So with phytic acids, this is the kind of thing that I understand how silly it sounds when I'm about to say it, because I thought the same thing the first time I heard it. But phytates or phytic acids are part of a small family of antinutrients. These are honest to goodness molecules found in plants that will deliberately and directly inhibit the digestion of certain stuff from the guts, including proteins and minerals like calcium, magnesium, copper, and zinc. We know this is well established. Phytic acids actually inhibit protein digestion, and they inhibit the uptake or the movement of minerals from the intestines into the blood. So when we are emphasizing people getting more magnesium, for example, if you're getting that magnesium with phytic acids, you're going to actually get less of the magnesium than you think you're getting. Or zinc. Zinc is a common one when it comes to antiviral therapies and antiviral treatments. Well, wouldn't you know it, if you're getting that zinc with phytic acids, you're getting less zinc from your guts into your blood. And these are, of course, essential minerals. We have to have them. Phytic acids are blocking this. And whole grain, healthy whole grain wheat has plenty of phytic acids. Now, it goes a little further than just grains. Every plant protein that is coming from all these seeds, pumpkin, pea, soy, etc., they also have phytic acids in them. And so the irony is you're getting not only an inferior source of protein, because it is inferior to animal proteins, but then you're also actually getting less of it than you think because of the phytic acids that are inherent to these seeds from these plants. So you're eating an inferior source of protein and you're actually absorbing even less. So all the more reason to stick to what nature has given us with regards to animal proteins. Now, the other molecule I want to mention is gliadin. Gliadin is a protein component of what we call gluten. And so everyone knows gluten. Gliadin is a molecule that can indeed elicit an immune response. There are people who are genuinely, they almost have this autoimmune, but they're attacking this molecule. But in the process of attacking gliadin, the intestines start to really pay the price, because that's where the immune process has to happen. So you can have much more inflammation at your intestines while the intestines are trying to attack this molecule. And then this, of course, starts to spill over into higher inflammation and inflammatory proteins circulating throughout the entire body. My view on it, if someone wants to invoke a historical context or defense of grains, my response is, well, then eat it the way our ancestors did, which would have been a very different plant than, say, wheat is. We have changed wheat over time to have much more starch in it and much more gluten and other molecules as well, and phytic acids included. So these are not healthy changes. Also, we've changed how we bake them or use these grains. Once upon a time, almost all of our consumption of grains would have had some form of fermentation, because we would have had to we wouldn't have had all the clever ingredients and chemicals we do to prevent things from spoiling. And we wouldn't have had rapid acting yeasts to accelerate the growth of whatever we were baking, whatever we were making with the wheat. So once upon a time, if we wanted that growth, we would have had to let it sit, and the bacteria would have done all that fermenting and producing all of that gas. So when bacteria are in the fermented dough or the grain, it's eating the starches and then releasing gas. And that gas is what's, of course, inflating the dough. So one thing about the fermented grains, the bacteria have done some of the work of digestion for us. But when you have bacteria that are eating the starch, then that's less starch we have to eat and digest and absorb. So the actual glucose load from a fermented bread compared to a real whole grain bread, even if they're both whole grain, fermented versus not, we get much less glucose because the bacteria have literally eaten some of the glucose for us. And in the process, released a gas, which is allowing the bread or the dough to rise, and it's released short chain fats. That's the byproduct of bacteria eating starches. And the short chain fats are not only a metabolic benefit to us, but they're also part of what gives the sourdough its, in my mind, a particularly pleasant tart flavor, because short chain fatty acids are tart by their very nature. Also, independent of the reduction in glucose that comes from fermenting like a true sourdough, you have a reduction in phytic acids. So the process of digestion actually will, or fermenting, will reduce the phytic acids by up to about 60%. And phytic acids, these are really, so remember, they're blocking the absorption of essential molecules and nutrients in the form of protein. And so we're getting more of what we actually might want from that whole grain. Actually, and if the whole grain, has more minerals than a refined grain, and it does, well, then all the more reason to try to cut those phytic acids down to get more of those. And one other comment about gliadin, and I have this study is also attached. Gliadin is a molecule, of course, that we eat and gets from our guts into our blood, and that can end up in mom's breast milk at significant levels. So when mom is eating this gliadin, she's giving it to her baby, and that might start to, I'm speculating a little here, but I can't help but wonder if that might be part of the growing sensitivity that kids are having at younger and younger ages. It's because they're literally getting it from their very first days as it's moving from mom's diet into mom's milk and then now into baby's diet. So in sum, if I were to focus on a few key takeaways on how whole grains are not the magic food, let alone superfood that many people would like to claim, one is that we have a genuine reduction in our ability to absorb nutrients and proteins, or well, I should say macronutrients in the form of protein and micronutrients in the form of minerals like magnesium, copper, zinc, and calcium. We can have an inflammatory response to some of the components of these whole grains, like to gliadin. And lastly, we're going to have a significant insulin response. And I end with insulin just because it's in my wheelhouse and it's so relevant to overall health. When you eat a whole grain versus a refined grain, the actual insulin response is shockingly similar. People would be very disappointed to see, and wearing something like a continuous glucose monitor really helps reveal that. You look at what happens to your glucose, knowing that your insulin is essentially following a similar line. You're going to have a significant insulin response, even to the so-called healthy whole grains, and insulin matters. Chronically elevated insulin is a much better predictor of a heart attack than cholesterol level, than LDL or total cholesterol. Chronically high insulin is going to drive other pathologies like hypertension through distinct mechanisms, fatty liver disease, infertility, Alzheimer's, and accelerate certain forms of cancer, if not cause them, accelerate them. So yeah, once upon a time, not even that long ago, certainly 100 plus years ago, well within the realm of modern history, wheat was very, very different, let alone 200 years ago. If you look at what they called wheat, our ancestors from several generations ago, it would be unrecognizable to the wheat that we have now. That older wheat would often have been something called spelt, which is a very different grain, and it bakes very differently. When you guys might have experience with this, when you try to bake with spelt, you're going to get something very different. It's not as good. Well, I mean, it can be perfectly yummy, but it's not going to be as kind of light and fluffy, in part because it has much less gluten in it. And gluten is something that has been almost worked in. It's been emphasized in this production of new modern grains because you can bake with it so well. It is gluey, it is sticky, and so it lets you have a bread that is much fluffier and just, a little more palatable rather than being just a little tougher or thicker. So combining the fact that we've had much older forms of wheat that you can still get, like encorn and spelt, that have much less starch in them, up to half of as much of this amylopectin A, or the main starch, and much less gluten, and likely phytic acids, although I'm not certain on how well that's been quantified. But combine the fact, that one detail, a very different grain that was called wheat, and that it would have been always fermented in some way, shape, or form, cutting down the starch and cutting down the gluten even more in this process of fermenting. So to me, when people want to defend wheat in a historical context, saying we should eat wheat because our ancestors would have, well, our ancient ancestors certainly did not. Our more modern ancestors most certainly did, although I'm sure at a fraction of the amount we're consuming it now. But then let's eat it the way they did. Get an older wheat and get it fermented in some way. And I realize that's kind of a hurdle, and people will say, well, I can't do that. And I'll say, well, then don't eat it.
The other thing I think that I've heard recently that's really fascinating is this idea that celiac disease has exponentially grown. Like a little over a decade ago, there was one in like 2,500 people that had celiac disease, and now it's like 1 in 133. And if you look at the changes that we've seen since the 1960s in grains, in wheat, that's just a correlation. But it sure makes me wonder if these older grains are much healthier and, you are able to absorb more protein and less phytic acid and stuff than these newer ones.
Yep. And well, guys, one thing, Carly, as you mentioned, celiac disease, it's so interesting to note how celiac disease can then pull the trigger for other problems. For example, well, every autoimmune disease needs a trigger. You have a genetic predisposition, and there's something in the environment that lights that up. And now you actually have the manifestation of the autoimmunity. People with celiac disease are 20 times more likely to develop type 1 diabetes. It's a shocking, and that's part of the reason why type 1 diabetes will never start until a person has started to eat solids. If it starts before they're eating solids, it's not type 1. It's usually going to be MODY, M-O-D-Y. It's something we've spoken about previously.
MODY, which is maturity onset diabetes of the young, is a rare type of diabetes that runs in families. It affects the way the body uses and stores sugar from food.
But there has to be an environmental trigger to virtually every autoimmunity. Type 1 diabetes is no exception, and it's entirely possible that wheat is the main finger on the trigger. I generally consider oats to be better than wheat. I know there's a lower glucose response and insulin response to oats versus wheat. Of course, oats will have little or no gluten, and I like that. That's nice to those who are sensitive to it. And I would actually it depends. When it comes to the pure starch and insulin effect, I would put rice as one of the biggest offenders, actually, even worse than wheat, potentially, especially some of the more sticky rice. That is almost 100% starch. There's almost essentially nothing else in it. But of course, it would depend on the rice. And, a more kind of whole grain brown rice would have a little maybe more comparable starch level to what you see, but a different starch, but what you see compared to wheat.
And I would say I kind of am starting to wonder if it's not so much the grain that's the issue, but it's the way we're farming it. A lot of these modern grains, one is called Springfield wheat, that we have over 1 million acres in the United States growing this grain. It's owned by a chemical company. A chemical company produces this wheat because they have morphed it and changed it so that you can spray a chemical somewhat like glyphosate on the crop and kill all the weeds so that you'll get a higher yield in your harvest. And what is that doing to us? What is ingesting those chemicals doing to our gut lining? Your gut lining is much more susceptible to taking in those chemicals than, say, like your skin if you were outside spraying it. So I kind of feel like that's the issue. And some of these, if you look for an ancient grain or an heirloom grain, those are ones that haven't been hybridized and changed and made so that you can spray chemicals on it, like kamut and einkorn and stuff.
Yeah.
I don't think quinoa has any gluten, which would be a positive for those who are worried. I know from my own tests, it has much less of a glucose response when I'm wearing my CGM. So I think quinoa is probably one that could be used a little more liberally or looked at as a grain of choice if you're going to use any. I would certainly put it over wheat.
Mm-hmm.
I had an uncle who was overweight and sick, and he started sprouting ancient grains, ancient wheat, and making himself these waffles with it. And that's basically all he ate. And the change in his body was remarkable.
Wow.
I know that when you sprout things, the available proteins and nutrients are higher. You absorb more. It's more useful. So I think that's probably a much better way to eat grains, is to sprout them.
Starch is a huge class of, well, not that huge, but it's a big class of food. And that involves undigestible starches like fibers. And then it includes digestible starches, like just starch, like what just turns into glucose immediately. So psyllium husk is a soluble fiber. And so that is a fiber that we don't digest. Our enzymes, our kind of human-made enzymes can't digest it. So that's what makes it a fiber. But the bacteria can digest it in our large intestine. And so it's considered a prebiotic fiber, soluble fiber. That's in contrast to insoluble fiber, which is not digestible by anything and just sort of scrapes its way down the intestines, providing just bulk. The studies that have been done looking at apple cider vinegar in particular, they were looking at meals that involved wheat. So wheat was the primary starch in these. And this was studies, I think, in type 2 diabetics. But yeah, apple cider vinegar, I think it's pretty safe to say it's going to blunt the glycemic and insulin response to virtually every starch, whether it would be rice or wheat. I can't imagine it would make any difference.
Isn't cereal, oatmeal, bread, pancakes, waffles, muffins, bagels, just about everything just a different form of the same thing metabolically?
Yep.
Yep, I think it is, right?
Yep, it is. Yeah. They're all delicious.